Community has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.
In the name of God, the gracious, the merciful, may the peace and blessings of Almighty God be upon you. Welcome to this, our third episode of Press Point. Today, we're looking at one simple question. Are religious freedoms at risk around the world? And if so, what can we do about it? We're going to look at three geographic areas. We're going to start in the West, so to speak, which is going to be Europe and the US. Then we're going to turn and take a look at South Asia. And then we're going to finish and wrap up with Africa. I'm here in the studio with my beloved brother, Farouk.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you very much for giving me time. This programme is all about your interaction as well with us. So certainly send us your emails and tweets to PressPointMTA, as well as anything that happened to you in the case of your freedoms being taken away anywhere in the world, whoever you are. You're a Muslim, non-Muslim, doesn't matter. Just share with us your ideas. Anybody else you see whose freedoms have been taken away, share with us and we'll share with the MTA's worldwide audience, Jonathan.
Farouk, I know you've been doing a bit of research. What is the global outlook for religious freedom across the world?
Not very good. Looking at this map, for example, if you can see the map on the screen on MTA at the moment, of course, this is a map of the worldwide situation at the moment, which is opencanada.org is a website by the Canadian International Council. The left side, of course, is the western part of the world, which is looking slightly better, apparently. The darker shades on the right side, the dark shade shows there are very high levels of restrictions on religious freedom in those parts of the world. And of course, these are Middle East, for example. Here it's China, Pakistan, India, going Southeast Asia, Malaysia and Indonesia are looking very dark. Looking at this pie chart here, it's looking not very good at all. 67% of the cases where the situation hasn't improved, 32%, that's 1 in 3, it is going worse by the day. Only 1% of the cases where the situation is getting any better. So certainly it's very, very bad indeed. And who's the victim? Everyone. Christians, 130 countries, Muslims, 117 countries, Jews, 75 countries. So we all are victims of this global problem.
So it's a major issue of concern which we need to pay serious attention to, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay. So we've been very lucky to have been able to interview essentially the world's expert on religious freedom, the UN Special Rapporteur on Religious Freedom. Let's go to the interview now. Mr. Bielefeld, looking at some recent research from the Pew Research study, it suggests that about 75% of the world's population live in countries that perpetrate or tolerate serious abuses of religious freedom. So in your capacity as the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion, how grave is the threat to religious freedom in the world today?
I personally don't work with quantitative data. I mean, that's something that distinguishes my approach from the approach taken by the Pew Forum, but I share their view that we are faced with rising restrictions in many countries in the world. And, I mean, of course, the world is a very complex phenomenon, but we see deteriorating trends in quite a number of countries in which minorities have been targeted, also killed. And, I mean, typical victims include Christian minorities, Baha'is, Ahmadis, Sufis, Falun Gong, Buddhists, agnostics, atheists, so a very broad range of different groups in different countries, and I mean there's a lot to do, in fact.
Right. In some earlier shows we've touched upon issues of blasphemy laws. To look at the Ahmadiyya community,
yes.
How are these blasphemy laws impacting upon the Ahmadiyya community, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, there are even clauses within the blasphemy laws that specifically target Ahmadis, which are prevented from identifying themselves as Muslims. I mean, their self-understanding is they are Muslims, not every Muslim is supposed to share that self-understanding, but at least it must be respected as their sense of who they are, and expressing that self-understanding, be it explicitly, be it implicitly by certain acts, for instance, by even using the Islamic form of greeting, already can become a case of the blasphemy law. So, I mean, some of those clauses specifically and explicitly target this group of people, the Ahmadiyya community, but also the more general, the broader clauses. I mean, they are very often vaguely defined. I mean, can easily be invoked in particular to intimidate members of the Ahmadiyya community, and we do have a number of cases in this regard.
Yes. You mentioned some of the abuses which are taking place against religious groups, for example in Pakistan with the blasphemy laws. What are you, as the UN Special Rapporteur on Religious Freedom, able to do about this?
Of course, I mean, all the serious and meaningful changes must primarily come from the societies themselves. So from within a society, from within Pakistan. And I mean, it's clear Pakistan is not a monolithic society. If you remember, for instance, the impact that Pakistan had in the discussions on the 1948 Human Rights Declaration, when the then foreign minister made a very clear statement on behalf of a broad and liberal understanding of freedom of religion or belief, including the right to change. You see there's a potential in all societies.
Mm-hmm. Could I turn our focus now to the so-called West?
Yes, sure.
I mean, recently we've seen French and Belgian bans, for example, on conspicuous religious symbols.
Yes.
Impacting obviously on Islamic headscarves, Sikh turbans, large Christian crosses. Are religious freedoms under threat in the West?
Yeah, there are problems in the West as well. It's not that we can say the West has done its homework and now it's up to the rest of the world to do it. No, definitely. And the examples that you gave, I mean, do give rise to concerns. Of course, freedom of religion or belief as enshrined in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights clearly entails also the possibility of public manifestations. So it's not just a private affair. If people want to keep their beliefs privately, okay, that's their decision. But freedom of religion or belief is not reduced just to the private sphere. So the possibility to also show one's belief, to demonstrate it, to manifest it, be it by words, by deeds, by symbols, by observing dress codes, that's part of it. I'm clearly advocating a more liberal approach also to dealing with headscarf issues in schools. I mean, we have also cases in Germany, my home country, which I would say are freedom of religion cases.
Excellent. Now we've got a news here. I think the first story you can follow is from the western part of the world. This is about a cross ban on the Guardian newspaper. It says cross ban did infringe BA workers' rights, Strasbourg court rules. Nadia Wade is awarded €2,000 compensation after being prevented from wearing a cross at work. She's a lady who worked for British Airways as a check-in worker, and her right to express her religion was unfairly restricted when she was prevented from wearing a cross at work, the European Court of Human Rights has ruled. It's a very positive and a heartening story.
Okay, but let's go to our studio guests. We're very blessed to have two very knowledgeable studio guests with us today. On my immediate left, Mr. Rafiq Kiyat. Assalamu alaikum. This is President of the UK Jamaat, the UK community within the United Kingdom. And also assalamu alaikum to Khalil Yusuf. He is from the Central Press Desk for the Islam Ahmadiyya community worldwide. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Mr. Yusuf, can I come to you and ask you a question about this? How significant is this case, and what's going to happen to religious freedoms as a result?
Well, I mean, we've looked at this map about religious freedoms worldwide, and of course what you see from that is that you have different degrees of restrictions on religious freedoms, and actually, as restrictions go, Britain's really good. We don't have huge amounts of religious restrictions, and in fact, for our founder of our community was even quite clear about saying how Britain had really led the way in ensuring that there were religious freedoms long before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But this is an interesting story because Nadia Awida in 2006 was sent home by British Airways because she was wearing a fairly visible cross. She brought a claim in Britain, and that was rejected by the British courts, and then she went on to the European Court of Human Rights to challenge her right to be able to wear a visible cross. The European Court at the time listened to a number of cases, and in Nadia's case, they suggested that she would be allowed to wear a cross. In another case, in the case of Shirley Chaplin, who was a nurse, the ECHR decided that she couldn't wear a cross. And the distinction between the two that the court was drawing was that individuals should have the right to practice their religion and belief, provided that it doesn't cause harm for others. So in the case of Shirley Chaplin, who was a nurse, wearing a cross may have caused a health and safety issue. So that wasn't about restricting her religious freedom, but there were really good reasons why, in those circumstances, she was prevented from doing so. So I would say, you know, in Britain we really have a good balance.
Yes. What then about, I mean, it's well known in France, in Belgium, there are these bans essentially on conspicuous religious symbols. What does a judgment like this mean for Europe as a whole? I mean, what about those bans? Do they have to come to an end?
I'm glad you raised this point, because when you look at France, you look at Belgium, you look at some of these other countries, the situation is really quite different. You've mentioned the ban on headscarves, but also that ban is in relation to large Russian crosses, it's in relation to Sikh turbans, it's in relation to the Jewish yarmulke. So in France, you're not allowed to have any displays of religious epithets, if you like, in a public building or in schools. So the situation is quite different in France, and what you find, if you look at the United States Report on International Religious Freedom, you find that instances of discrimination against the Muslim community have been up by 34%. And there's a discussion to be had as to the extent to which legislation in France, which is preventing people from practicing their faith, is actually crystallizing or causing discrimination in some of these countries.
Yes, okay. If I can come to you, Mr. Hiat, I mean, what is the solution to these problems? I mean, we know on both sides we have people that are intractably saying this is causing damage to our society for you to express your religion and to manifest it, to wear the burqa or the niqab. What's the answer for Europe moving ahead?
Well, I think as far as Europe is concerned, firstly, the freedom of religion is defined in Article 9 of the Human Rights Act, and that gives freedom of expression, of conscience, of religion to all the people living within Europe. And that becomes the fundamental principle upon which Europe defines its policy on religious freedom. However, in recent years we've seen a change at national levels away from some of this policy. And part of that actually comes from religious extremism that we're seeing in the world. And as a result of what happened as a result of the terrorist attacks in Europe, we've seen some of the governments changing its policy and bringing in restrictions, initially on the Muslims, but then they get extended to other communities as well. So I think the best way forward is for us to firstly deal with this issue of extremism and address this Islamophobia that exists in the West, that, you know, Muslims are terrorists per se. And if we can deal with that issue, and the best way to deal with it is to actually spread the true teaching of Islam to the people of this world.
Okay.
And
can I ask you on that then? So, I mean, the true teachings of Islam, some people might say, for example, if you have a passport photo done, you shouldn't be able to wear a full burqa which covers the face. Is there any limit which should be placed upon manifesting your religion in public? You know, should there be a limit in that realm, do you think? Or
well, of course. I mean, the thing is that parda is a big issue in the West generally, and I think some of the people don't understand, especially in some European countries. But when these issues came up, especially in France, I remember we were dealing with a lot of the politicians in Britain, and categorically all of them stated that this would not happen in the UK. That the religious freedoms in the UK will always be preserved to the highest level, and that we will never see. I think, again, it is an issue that West does not understand. They think parda is a restriction on our women, and that makes them second-class citizens in some way. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed. And partly this has to be done by the women themselves to show that this is not a restriction on them, that it protects the, gives them a protection which is very, very important in their daily lives. Right. And I think that is a way forward by making these things clearer to the society that we live in. What are the benefits of such things?
Right. So understanding and clarity of Islam. So you've mentioned a key point. You've mentioned Islamophobia. So if we could go to the US now and go to our correspondent in the US, Mr. Amjad Khan, we've heard of talk of Islamophobia. How is this expressing itself in the US and in particular in New York in relation to a recent poster campaign on the tube?
Yes, assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
Alaikum salam.
There is this growing hysteria around Muslims in America. There are now ad campaigns that are attacking the core principles of Islam, and there certainly is a rise in religious bigotry here in the United States. And the way that Muslims are countering it, including the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, is to take out counter bus ads and project the true teachings of Islam. So I think it's been, there's really an interesting intersection and sometimes a collision between freedom of religion and freedom of expression in the United States. But I have to say that by and large, religious freedom is quite strong in the United States. And comparatively to the European experience, American Muslims are doing quite well. And that is because the genesis of America, the very founding of America, is built upon the first freedom, which is religious freedom, the first words of the U.S. Bill of Rights, the first words of the First Amendment, really protect religious freedom, and not just religious liberty, but prohibits any legislation that would favor or prefer one religion over the other. So I think by and large, the protections are quite robust, and American Muslims are doing quite well.
Right. You've raised an interesting point. You've talked about religious freedom, but then what an American, or what Pamela Geller, who's putting these posters up, would say back to you is, what about my freedom of expression? So how do you answer that? They would say they have the right to put these posters up in order to express themselves.
And legally speaking, she's absolutely correct. There are strong protections to allow one to express their point of view, no matter how nefarious. And so she likened Muslims to savages in this ad campaign in New York. But the way to counter that, according to the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York, is more speech. So they permitted to allow American Muslims to take ads to counter that. And so, in the United States, the way you counter such nefarious speech is by more speech. That is just the way the legal regime is set up. But unlike Europe, there will not be any federal legislation that will withstand constitutional scrutiny. I mean, in the middle of this country, in Oklahoma, there was an attempt to ban the headscarf. And the U.S. government intervened on behalf of Muslims to stop that act, and it was struck down as unconstitutional. And that will repeatedly happen in the U.S. court system. Because of the First Amendment, there are strong protections on religious freedom. So this is of a private nature. It will never come from the legislative sphere the way it has, for example, in the European countries.
Okay. So from yourself then, combat poor speech with free speech and more of it, better speech. Let me thank you very much, Mr. Khan, and may God bless you, and God willing, we'll speak to you again in the future. Let me come back to yourself, Mr. Hayat. You've told us about Islamophobia. We've heard about combating conceptions of Islam in America. What's the best way to deal with it here in the UK, this issue of Islamophobia?
Yes, I think Hazur Aqdas has actually given us direction on this, and he said to us that we need to make the whole society, not just part society, but the whole society aware of what true teaching of Islam is. And as a result, about 3 years ago, we started a leafleting campaign throughout the United Kingdom where the true teaching of Islam was actually given house to house. And so far, by the grace of Allah, we've reached over 3 million households. And to complement that, we also did a campaign in the media, through the press, through the newspapers. A lot of the media was very interested to find out what we were doing, and from that the story spread, and we had all the national media picking up the story and running with it. And to supplement that, we also started a bus campaign. And the bus campaign became so attractive that a number of the media people actually seeing the bus campaign came to us and said, we would like to know more about your community. And through that, the word has been spreading. But then we also hold things like the peace conferences, where a large number of people come and we are able to communicate the message of peace to the whole world through that. And we've also started a peace prize. Yes. Again, the whole thing, backs one backs the other. And through that, we are able to continue to spread the message of peace to the West. And at the same time, we also have to deal with the decision makers of this country. So we held an event in the Parliament here where Hazur Ebdas went and addressed the parliamentarians, again on the issue of peace, how you can achieve peace. And he said that peace can only be achieved if you have equality and fairness in society. And one of the things that the Promised Messiah, al-Islam, when he sent a message to Queen Victoria, actually praised Queen Victoria and her government for having equity, fairness, and freedom of religion in her. And Hazur Ebdas, now Queen Elizabeth II, sent her a similar message saying, again, that we were very proud that UK enjoyed freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of faith, and equality. And those are the issues that will make this a better society.
Right. So in fact, it's in order to overcome poor speech and Islamophobia, increasing our freedom and increasing our positive speech is the solution.
Indeed.
Yes.
And also we have to, you see, part of the problem is, unfortunately, the rest of the Muslims, some of their conduct is contrary to the true teaching of Islam. And they create this Islamophobia in this country. And what has happened, you can see now around the world, unfortunately, recently in Algeria, there was an attack on British subjects and other subjects. And all this feeds into that Islamophobia that exists. And unfortunately, unless the Muslim world changes, unless they start looking at this and thinking, what type of world are we living in? What is it that we're trying to create? We've seen the problems in Pakistan. We've seen the problems in Europe. We saw 7/7 here, 9/11 in the States. All that has fed into it. We had a public that was very secular and acceptable of all different cultures, and we talk about multiculturalism in this country. And yet, the continuous bad news from the Islamic world continues to build a phobia in the society, which is worrying.
All right, okay. And so, Farouk, I think you've also, building on these comments, you've had a lot of online media tweets on this topic, haven't you?
Comments at the moment. Nigel Farage, who's the leader of the UKIP party, he even went to Brussels with me to listen to his memorable speech, of course, a momentous day. He has actually tweeted, is his personal opinion, pleased that right to be a worker, to wear cross at work was upheld. It was right decision in the wrong court, he says. Also, another one, very balanced kind of a message from Casey in her Twitter account. She says that, just to clarify, I'm all for religious freedom, but to place the Bible in school would also have to place the Quran, Torah, etc. That's her view. So I think we can move on with those couple of comments.
So that sums up part one, which is looking at freedom of religion in the West and is it at risk? And I think it's quite clear that we have our own problems here in the West. Now, the next section is looking at South Asia, with a particular focus on Indonesia and Malaysia. Now, we've been lucky enough to have Knox Thames from the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, and we've had an interview with him, with our brother Farouk. So let's go to that now.
Now, we're joined here by Knox Thames, who's the Director of Policy and Research at the US Commission for International Religious Freedom. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Thames. Well, South Asia has been seeing a huge number of such violations. What do you think the key players like US, the key players when it comes to policy making, can do to protect the religious freedoms in that part of the world?
Our commission, as this independent entity that's established by the U.S. government, we've been very vocal in saying, for example, on the situation of Pakistan, our government needs to do more to push religious freedom to the front of the agenda in Pakistani and U.S. bilateral relations. I think the horrible bombing of the Shia areas in Baluchistan a week or so ago is another example of how the environment there is just horrendous. You look at the Ahmadi community in Pakistan, it's basically an apartheid system where every element of their faith has been banned, and the government actively goes after them when cases are brought to their attention. So there's a lot that needs to be done, and I think there's more the United States can do, as well as other nations with a similar commitment to human rights.
Now, you mentioned Pakistan, I appreciate, but of course the issue is not just contained in Pakistan anymore. It's gone far and wide. For example, even Malaysia and Indonesia are also the countries which have seen violations recently. So what do you think could be done now by the international community to curb this problem?
Yeah, I think Pakistan's in a league by itself, but our commission has been very closely monitoring the situation in Indonesia. While seeing Indonesia return to a democratic governance was certainly a positive, it's also unleashed a wave of social actors who are wanting to use the force of government to apply their religious beliefs upon the entire population. That's problematic for the Muslim majority, but also for the different minority religious communities you're seeing in Indonesia. In the past couple of years, we've seen an increase in closures of churches and mosques that don't line up to a particular ideology. And we think this is going to hamper Indonesia's growth and progress towards a stable and democratic country.
Right, of course, I understand. We have talked about this issue in Pakistan as well, and coming back to Pakistan, I think it's important to understand that the issue is far more deep-rooted and embedded in the society. For example, even schools have this problem where students are given books where very clearly they are being taught hate and intolerance for other groups in the society. So what do you think could be done to curb that in countries like Pakistan?
Yeah, well, education is the long game, and our commission issued a study about a year ago on looking at Pakistan's education system, both in the secular system and in the madrasa system, about how religious minorities are addressed in the curricula and by teachers. And the findings were deeply troubling. We saw that teachers were teaching, the textbooks were speaking to, and students were learning that religious minorities are the other, that they're not equal, that they're less valued. And that's deeply problematic, as you're saying, for the future of that country. What to do now? I think it goes back to getting the central government in Islamabad and also the governments in the different provinces to stand up, to have political courage, to say, no, enough is enough. All citizens of Pakistan are equal and should have their rights respected, and to start to create that wall so that this rising tide of violent religious extremism will finally be pushed back or abated.
Right, moving on from, of course, West to Southeast Asia now. I have a story here on the Time magazine's World section. It says, "Can Christians say Allah? In Malaysia, Muslims say no." Now, that story says, why are Christians claiming Allah? Asked businessman Rahim Ismail, 47, his face contorted in rage and disbelief. The reason for their anger is a recent judgment by Malaysia's High Court that word Allah is not exclusive to Muslims. A good judgment, but of course, looking at this news does worry us all. That is on RT's news website. It says, Malaysian Sultan forbids using Allah outside Islam. He says that the news says, Sultan of the Malaysian state, Selangor, has issued a decree that the sacred word Allah can be used only by Muslims. The move put more fire into controversy in the state where language peculiarities are also make Christians use the term. And at the end it says, a stern action was ordered against those questioning the new fatwa, but did not elaborate on the word stern. So it is worrying, isn't it?
Okay, so basically in Malaysia we have a decree saying you cannot use the word Allah unless you're Muslim.
That's a
so very concerning.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go over now to Indonesia to our correspondent, Mr. Febi Yonesta. Febi Yonesta is particularly from the chairperson of Jakarta Legal Aid. Assalamualaikum warahmatullah, Febi.
Waalaikumsalam.
So you're in Indonesia at the moment. I mean, what is your understanding of this Malaysian decree?
Yeah, my understanding about this issue in Malaysia is that it was firstly in 2007 issued by the Home Ministry that prohibited the Catholic from using Allah for God. I think it's kind of a state intervention of a religion that which it has been counterproductive to the interreligious harmony and as well as the freedom of religion or belief.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned sort of the counterproductive nature of it. What about the wider region across Southeast Asia, and particularly you're in Indonesia? I mean, what's the outlook for religious freedoms in the region?
Yeah, as we can see in the case of Malaysia, it also happened in other countries in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, for example, in Thailand, in Philippines, and as well as in Indonesia. That there's the government cannot stand neutral in terms of religion. And the government sometimes make intervention to religious life. And it's somehow also seen as counterproductive to freedom of religion and belief in Indonesia, in those countries. In case of in Indonesia, we saw that it's always been a sensitive issues in our social life. Practicing religion in Indonesia as well as in other countries in ASEAN, especially for religious minority, not as free as the major religious majorities. So the thing is that the governments seems that they have a political interest in imposing their policy toward the religious minorities, so that they want the political gain from political support from the majorities to
Mr.
support their power.
You've talked about sort of the government, their duties, but we get a sense that there's a real danger from, in fact, the Islamic community or perhaps the Muslim community in terms of threats towards minorities within, say, Indonesia. I mean, how real is the fear amongst religious communities that aren't mainstream within Indonesia? What is the sense of how free is it? How free are you to practice your religion within Indonesia in light of that threat?
In terms of in Indonesia, so for religious minorities, in terms of practicing religion, is very, very threatening. I mean, not only the Christian, the Shia, also the Ahmadiyya is, as the most persecuted religious minorities, has been suffering so many persecutions done by the religious intolerance. So in most cases, that the government is not really protecting religious minorities in Indonesia. So no a strict stance against this religious intolerance that done so many persecution against the religious minorities.
Mr. Febiionesta, thank you very much. We're going to have to end the call now because of time. May God bless you and thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Mr. Khalil Yusuf, we've seen some tragic videos from Indonesia. We've seen pictures of mob violence taking place there. I mean, how real is the threat to religious freedom within Indonesia and Southeast Asia more generally?
I mean, it's very real. If you look at a number of the reports that have been carried out by international organisations on religious freedom in that whole region, all of them will tell you that it is a real problem. I mean, the difficulty is that in the West, I just want to make this one small point, in the West you kind of have a contradictory issue. On one hand you have a ban on burqas, and on the other hand you go out and say to countries in Southeast Asia and elsewhere that, well, you should be democratic, you should have freedom of religion. So in the West we kind of need to take responsibility about making sure that we give a consistent message. But when you have examples in Malaysia where, for instance, you have in the Selangor region the Sultan saying, well, people other than Muslims can't use the word Allah. I mean, it goes against really the fundamental basis of Islam, because one of the fundamental principles of Islam is, of course, the unity of Allah, and we believe there's only one God. So I find it quite bizarre that you have an individual saying, well, Allah is for us and you've got your own God for Christians. I mean, that doesn't work within the theology of Islam.
It's running counter to the freedom central in Islam.
And that leads on to, the real issue here actually, is that there are a number of clerics within Southeast Asia who are using religion for political purposes. And this is a point that was made by the last speaker. And the reason is that it's very difficult to get a majority government, and so you need coalitions, and therefore you have religious minority groups, religious political groups who use religion in order to get votes. The reality is that Islam really does protect freedom of religion. You know, you look at chapter 2, it says there's no compulsion in religion. Chapter 10, you know, it says that if Allah wanted everybody to have one religion, well, he would have done that. And even Surah Al-Kafirun says, my religion for me and me for you. My religion for me and your religion for you. And you see that in the practice of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you look at the Covenant of Medina, he provided religious freedom to people of all faiths, you know, and indeed if they had done something wrong, they would be sentenced under their own religious laws. So when you look at what Islam actually says, by reference to the Holy Quran and the Holy Prophet ﷺ, and what we say as a community in 202 countries of the world, you find actually that the brand of Islam that is propagated across Southeast Asia isn't really Islam at all.
Okay. So it's not Islam at all is perhaps what we might conclude, but Mr. Hayat, I mean, why is this happening? Viewers at home might be saying, well, we see Muslims all over the world doing this, so this must be Islam. But what is going on and why?
Yes, I think if you look at the history of Indonesians and the Southeast Asians, they were gentle people, you know, very respectable people. And their culture was that of respect. So why is it that suddenly we see this change? Well, if you look at it, actually the problem actually emanates from Pakistan. And the link is Jamaat-e-Islami. If you look at what is happening in Indonesia and Malaysia, you will find the link is Jamaat-e-Islami. And if you see that in this concept actually emanates from Pakistan, in Pakistan the Ahmadis are not allowed to just even use Islamic terminology. We can't say Assalamu alaikum, otherwise we'll be locked up for 3 years. And that intolerance about using terminology which is Islam, so-called Islamic, is now being transferred into the Southeast Asia. And therefore you see that Allah now suddenly has become a term that the Muslims are saying, no, this is only Muslim term.
Okay, so it's coming in from Pakistan. I mean, Mr. Yusuf, I mean, what can we do about this if this is the case? If it is a sort of a creep of extremism coming from these countries, what does the future look like for the Southeast Asian region in terms of religious freedom, and what can we do about it?
Look, I mean, I think it's important to say, you know, we wish absolutely well to all of these countries, and we have no argument or no dispute with any particular individual. But what we do say is where you've got governments in place, they should provide equal religious protection to all communities. It's not just about Ahmadi Muslims, it's not just about Christians or about Hindus, it's about Jews as well. It's about people of all faiths having the entitlement to be able to practice their own faith, because religion is about an individual. It's not really about a collective to say, well, a state is to decide which religion you should have and which religion you shouldn't. All of the international treaties, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ICCPR, the African Charter, the American Convention, the ECHR, they all say the same. Everybody should have the freedom to practice their own religion. So in Pakistan, I mean, really what we need is a wider debate really about, well, what is the role of religion within Islam? And the other thing that we need is a separation of religion and politics. You know, I mean, if you start to use religion as a political tool, which is what's been happening with a number of these religious clerics, then you have these problems. And I think that's something that we need to look at.
Okay.
Yes. I think the thing is that, you know, when Pakistan was going through this, at that stage it was purely a political thing that Bhutto wanted to solve a problem that he claimed was a 90-year problem for Islam. And he was not interested in Islam himself, but he thought that he could win favor with the mullahs by declaring us non-Muslims. And at that stage, Khalifa Salis said that today you're declaring us as non-Muslims, but tomorrow this thing will spread to other communities. And the hatred that you will built up will destroy your society. And what we're seeing in Pakistan today is that now that has been used against the Shias, against the other minority groups. And Pakistan, you saw that in Pakistan at this moment in time there are intercommunal feuds taking place, sectarian killings taking place. And now Pakistan is a very crucial point where they have to decide what is it that they want. And if they continue with this hatred, this message of hatred, they're going to spread it to other parts of the world, and then that will, create a problem throughout the world and destroy the whole society.
Almost for the
very,
world.
very crucial time, and really all the Muslims have to get together and decide. The mullahs or their leaders have to get together and decide what is it that's going on, where are we going wrong, how do we address it, and we have to find a solution to this. Otherwise, the extremism will destroy our earth.
All right, okay. So it sounds like it's a crucial time, not only for Southeast Asia, but in fact for religious freedom across the world.
We'll come to
What
Pakistan in a minute. I
sort of tweets have you
think there's a couple of tweets here waiting for us. One is from Harjinder S. Kukareja. He's a Sikh. And he mentioned something very inspirational. He says that Allah is mentioned 12 times in Guru Granth Sahib by Baba Farid. Guru Nanak, Guru Arjan and Saint Kabir have used the word Allah 18 times. He further says Malaysia banning non-Muslims from using Allah impacts religious freedoms of Sikhs. Allah is mentioned several times in Guru Granth Sahib. Then we have a message from Madiha Walker. She says the choice to dress as Muslim woman should not be taken away from us. Surely that would amount to oppression. And there's a question mark after that. So of course, the point Khalil Saab was making initially. I think let's move on from Southeast Asia to South Asia now, to Pakistan. There's a story which is a very sad one, of course, where Shia Hazara community begin burying dead following one of the worst sectarian violences in Pakistan's history. That's the Independent newspaper. This was, of course, there were Shias there, dead bodies lying outside for 4 nights, but 86 dead bodies actually in cold. The reason being, of course, a barbaric killing of those Shias. And then, of course, there's a photo there, which, of course, is very sad as well, on the New York Times blog. It says, a mourning online for Pakistani rights activists killed in Quetta bombing by Robert Mackley. There's a photo of a Pakistani activist, Irfan Ali, who in fact was killed in that brutal killing, and he was addressing a rally against sectarian attacks in Pakistan a few months before that. So of course it's ironic that he was anti-sectarianism and he's himself killed in such violence. So let's move on and have a look at what's happening in Pakistan then.
So it's a tragic story, isn't it? So I think we need really to hear from someone in Pakistan. So I think we were lucky enough to speak earlier on in the week to Naseem Zahra, who's a senior journalist from Dunya Television. Let's go to that interview now.
Last week or 10 days have been very difficult for Pakistan, of course. Amongst the other significant events, we saw a very sad event of Hazara Shias protesting the barbaric killings with over 80 bodies out in the cold for 4 days. Does that mean the conscience of the nation has reached all-time low, where people are left with no option but to protest in such a miserable way?
No, I don't think that says anything about the conscience. It does say something about the state and the government's ability to protect the people. Indeed, in this tragedy, if there was any silver lining that subsequently emerged, was that by the second day of this really heart-wrenching protest, where people had about 80 dead bodies of their loved ones, lying there, you had Pakistanis across the entire country, irrespective of race or religion, come out for these Shia Hazaras, and we saw in Multan, in Faisalabad, Karachi, Lahore, Peshawar, you saw that there were all-night sit-in protests, etc. So I would, if there's anything, in fact, we would say that these tragic events indicate to us, the response to these tragic events indicate that the conscience of the nation is there, but how does that get reflected into how the state and government conduct its constitutional obligations is the key question.
I fully appreciate your point, Ms. Zahra, but my question is, how can we ensure that the religious freedoms of every Pakistani citizen are protected there? So in specific, those groups that do not make themselves heard through violence. I mean, of course, you give an example here, but again, our concern is, if any change happens, does that mean any person who does not raise his voice through violence still remains unheard?
I would only say that, compared to the last 5 years, at least there is more there is more discussion about it, we can actually go on our television programs and talk about, what's happening to the minorities. And obviously, I would be the first one to add that it's far from sufficient. And as a Pakistani, I feel very pained that my Pakistani, brothers and sisters and so on go through this kind of difficult times. But I think, inshallah, we are, there is, as I started by saying, there is a conscience there, a collective conscience, and we have to continue to work on that and expand the parameters of that conscience, and so that it includes all Pakistanis and not just those who are either in a large number or are more active and are more able to express.
Now, with perhaps changing landscape of Pakistan politics, how do you see the internal security of Pakistan in particular with regards to the marginalized communities? Of course, I mean Hindus, Ahmadis, and so on and so forth.
Well, I think that, all of this is absolutely linked. At this point, you're dealing with 2 or 3 kinds of threats to internal sources of internal security. One is obviously, terrorists, etc., whatever. Then you have sectarian terrorism, which is kind of intolerance and so on and so forth. And I guess essentially these are the 2 dominant types, and obviously there's ethnic violence, etc. So all of that is, it's in some ways it's linked, it's interlinked, and it's going to. There is the issue of an environment of tolerating this, but the environment in which this is tolerated is more a function of the incapacity of the state on the one hand to enforce rule of law, because of which all of this happens. On the other hand, I mean, the state has unfortunately been a party to promoting some of these groups. And,
of course, in particular, what happens in Punjab, of course, streets, shops, and government offices are being full of banners against the community, of course.
Now you talk, let me come back to that. That's very specific. But I mean, I was just generally even saying. Generally, you've had, because of our policies in the 80s, etc. So that's when really what you see today is not a result of any social inequality. It's more a result of a particular kind of policy that the state promoted, and I think that there is a revision on that. When you come to the Ahmadiyya community, yes, that is something on which even greater realization is required within people, and certainly in the government too. When we had this incident of the unfortunate incident of gravestones being ransacked, I think the government was forced to respond, and it had a police kind of security and whatever around in the graveyard, but that's insufficient, and you can't have people being hit out at and then you respond. So I would again say that that's an area where more work needs to be done, a greater consciousness. But I'm quite sure that is going to come with time, which is obviously no great comfort for those who suffer here and now. But I think that inshallah we are headed in the right direction.
Inshallah, you sound very optimistic. I hope you're right, and we thank you very much for your time and wish you all the best. Keep up good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, as we heard, she had a great deal of optimism potentially for Pakistan. But Khalil, what's your sense of how serious is the risk to civil liberties and religious freedom at the moment in Pakistan? Very briefly, if you wouldn't mind.
I mean, it's very serious. I mean, when we talk about religious freedom, I mean, we don't mean religious freedom in the sense of Pakistan and some other countries where they have the free right to impose their own version of Islam on others. Religious freedom means having the ability for all communities to be able to practice their faith in an appropriate way. And when you find that you've got restrictions on religious freedom, you find that that impinges on other civil rights as well. So in Pakistan, for instance, now you've got major issues, not just in relation to practice of religion, but being able to pray, being able to vote, being able to access services. So the Ahmadiyya Muslim community and Christians and others do really suffer in that respect. I mean, I just want to make one point, because in relation to voting. You know, there are about 187 million or so people in Pakistan, and in order to vote as a Muslim, of which is 95% of the population, you need to sign a form, and that form says that denounces the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in the most derogatory and nasty terms. So that's not just an issue for Ahmadis actually being restricted in voting. What it also does is it means 95% of the population, 178 million people, also have to denounce the founder of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and that is a shocking indictment for Pakistan, because what it does is it legitimizes and makes usual or appropriate the persecution of Ahmadiyya Muslims.
Okay, so serious jeopardy is joking, I would say, from what we hear. I mean, Mr. Hiyat, what's the road ahead for Pakistan? Before we move on to the Africa section, just to give us a sense, just a brief sense of where religious freedom might head in Pakistan in the coming years.
You see, I think part of the problem lies in the way the West has dealt with Pakistan. The West also has to change the way it deals with Pakistan. And, you know, at the moment, the West is very happy for Pakistan to create chaos there that stops the chaos from coming into the West. So unless we deal with justice with Pakistan itself, and unless good leaders come out of Pakistan and say, enough is enough, you know, we'll continue with this chaos. At the moment, this story that you had, you know, these relates to the Shia group, and the people, the Taliban who murdered these, or who murdered these people, they want to cleanse Pakistan of the Shia, who are 20% of the population in Pakistan. So you can see that unless this sectarianism is addressed by all the scholars, by all the leaders, political leaders, they sit down and say, no, enough is enough, we're not going to tolerate this, we are going to deal with this issue at the core, I think this will continue.
Okay. So really, it's really coming down to everybody to recognise the seriousness of the threat, isn't it, I think, yeah? So before, I think that's the end of our section now for South Asia. Africa, what's happening in Africa?
Time, actually, can't do any more tweets for the time being. Let's have a look at a story on the BBC's Africa section. It says Nigerian militants kill 15 and slit throats. Suspected Islamist militants killed at least 15 Christians in northern Nigeria, slitting the throats of the victims, witnesses said. Of course, Nigeria is a very complicated place. Of course, Muslims and Christians have been fighting for a long, long time. This is in particular a case of Boko Haram killing the Christians.
Okay, so again, I think we need to hear this direct from Africa. Let's go now to Ghana to introduce Mr. Ibrahim Kiesi. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam.
Give us a sense of just what sort of an impact these recent killings in Nigeria have had across Africa as a whole.
Well, fortunately, in Ghana, the activities of Boko Haram are not felt. There is constitutional guarantees of religious freedom. Government respects freedom. In fact, among the national festivals, holidays to mark the Muslim festival of Eid al-Fitr and the Muslim festival of Eid al-Adha. They are public, not just holidays for Muslims, they are public holidays. And there is absolute harmony among Christians, Muslims, people of other faiths.
Right, well that's excellent. That's very good news. I mean, what's the key to Ghana's success in terms of protection of religious freedom? I mean, just very briefly before we come back to the studio, what is the key?
Pardon?
Just to get a sense of why is it that Ghana's doing so well in religious freedom? What's the key to success for protecting religious freedom from Ghana?
Well, for one thing, as I said, the Constitution guarantees freedom. And all governments, even though the presidents have been Christians, all governments in this country have respected the freedom to worship in any way a person likes within the Constitution. Moreover, Ghana, even though we belong to different tribes, there is a harmony. You can find in one family people who are Christians of various faiths, sects. You can find Muslims of various sects. You can find even people who worship, as we say, in the traditional way. And nobody, even though Ghanaians are said to be very religious, there isn't the kind of extremism which will create tension between one group and another. That is the secret of our success. Let me give one example. There is a National Peace Council. The chairman of the Peace Council is the Methodist National Bishop, and the vice chairman is the head of Ahmadiyya Muslim Mission in this country. And they get on very, very well. As I've said, the freedom is so guaranteed that Muslims are not in any danger at all of being persecuted. In fact, the president recently had cause to express concern when he heard that in some of the schools founded by the Christian mission, Muslim students are not allowed to worship the way they should. The president expressed concern and requested the Minister of Education to see to it that the practice was stopped.
Yes, okay. So I think it's what's very interesting then from Ghana is, thank you very much. We're going to take this back to the studio now. May God bless you, Mr. Ibrahim Kiesi. I mean, Farouk, there seems to be something quite special happening in Ghana. Of course, there's great problems across Africa. What's the online community telling us?
There's one message about Nigeria in particular from a Nigerian lady called Loretta Onochi. She says, she's given a very balanced kind of a message. She says, yes, there are very few, talking about the extremists. Yes, there are very few. These few are the leaders. They are the looters. They are from north and south, Christians and Muslims. North being the Muslims area and south being more Christians.
Okay, gosh. Let me go to Mr. Yusuf. I mean, we've heard it here that there seems to be, I mean, we can look at Mali, we can look at Somalia, we can look at Northern Sudan. The West is very concerned about what's happening in Africa. Are they right to be? But particularly in relation to religious freedom. How serious is the threat to religious freedom as a result of this, a number of tragedies really that have happened in Africa recently?
I mean, any time you use religion for political purposes, you're going to have problems. We've seen that in the discussion that we've had across today's programme. I mean, we as Muslims have a very special connection, actually, and love for Africa because, of course, Africa was the first place that some of the first persecuted Muslims who were in Mecca came to a place that was at that time called Habsha, that is now Ethiopia. And, of course, our Khalifa of Islam, Hazrat Khalifatul Masih, spent 8 years in Ghana as well. So we have a real special love for Africa, and all I can say is that we hope that really the communities unite and they think about the future of Nigeria, the future of countries within Africa, because, you know, they are very much the jewel of this world. They have huge natural resources and they have a real ability to be able to influence the rest of the world. There are some very educated people, very capable people in Africa, and they really need to come together and try and work out their differences for the good of Africa.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Hiat, I mean, the West seems to be incredibly worried, and so do all communities, about the threats that are developing within these countries. I mean, we've mentioned some of them, Mali, Algeria, the Maghreb as a whole, and Western Africa. Are they right to be concerned about this threat to religious freedom?
Very, very right. Firstly, let me just say something about Ghana. I mean, Ghana is a jewel in the crown, and even President Obama recognized that Ghana was very special in the whole of West Africa. And part of the reason, I think, is that good leadership and education are the two key elements which has made it a more tolerant and a more accepting society. Oh, right. Whereas in other parts of Africa, we are seeing the conflict taking place partly because of lack of education, and partly because other fundamentalists move in and try and spread hatred in the society. The situation in Africa is very worrying because we've seen now the conflict going to Mali, and now we see from Mali, although Algeria, who does not want this conflict, the conflict has come from Mali into Algeria, where we had the recent problems. And you can see that in spite of the so-called Arab Spring, we are finding that instead of stability, at this moment in time, we have to watch very carefully that the balance may tilt the other way. Okay. We are seeing throughout Africa, this is a major problem. Okay. We've seen it in Sudan, we've seen it in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in all these countries we're seeing conflict.
So we've got less than a minute left. I mean, what can we learn from Ghana that can offer the solution to Africa within less than a minute, if you wouldn't mind, Mr.
Again, education and leadership. Okay. I think those are the two key elements. If we can bring education to those people, take them away from the fundamentalists, and the governments, obviously the constitution has to decide what type of country they want, if they can bring in the right people at the right level and take out extremism, then they will have a healthy, developed society for the whole of Africa.
Education and leadership. So we've got less than, we're very close to the end now. So I think, in fact, what we've seen overall today, Farouk Saab, is that religious freedom is in great jeopardy around the world. But perhaps the final comment here, education and leadership is absolutely key. And so we, as Muslims and members of the Ahmadiyya community, very much offer an educated form of Islam and the leadership in the form of Hazrat Amir al-Mu'mineen, the leader of the believers, or our current Caliph of Islam.
That's the best of both worlds.
Perfect.
One thing that the rest of the world haven't got
sadly, I think they're about to close us off. So inshallah, we'll have you on again, Amir Saab, if that's okay. Thank you very much to our guests, and thank you to all of the presenters and correspondents who came on board. Please join us for our next show, the 4th episode of Press Point, and until then, please remember us in your prayers, and may the peace and blessings of God be upon you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Has launched the campaign to try and counter the extremists.
Now speaking out to denounce terror and extremism.
30,000 people formed a human chain in the south this afternoon in the name of peace.
We're asking if religious intolerance is on the rise.
We believe that religious freedom is a fundamental human right.
Giving a message that Islam is a religion of peace.
We must all endeavor to spread love and a sense of community.